A billionaire CEO freezes when he sees his lost childhood toy in a boy's hands at a bus stop. He kneels down, voice shaking. "Where did you get this? Before we dive in, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button to support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and let the story begin." Everything in Paul Blackwood's meticulously controlled world came to a screeching halt on that ordinary Tuesday morning. The 52-year-old billionaire CEO of Blackwood Enterprises stood frozen on the rain-slicked sidewalk, his Italian leather shoes rooted to the spot as if suddenly filled with concrete, his breath caught painfully in his chest. The world around him, the bustling downtown financial district of Boston that typically bent to his will, faded into a meaningless blur of motion and sound. All that remained in crystal-clear focus was the small, worn stuffed rabbit clutched in the hands of a boy no more than 7 years old, waiting with his mother at the bus stop across the street. It wasn't just any stuffed animal. It was Hoppy, his Hoppy, the exact same faded blue rabbit with the missing left ear and the hand-stitched patch on its belly that had disappeared from Paul's life 39 years ago, during the most traumatic night of his childhood. The toy that had vanished, along with everything else Paul had ever loved, on the night his family's modest home had burned to the ground, taking his parents with it and leaving a 13-year-old boy with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a determination forged in fire that he would never be vulnerable again. The luxury sedan with Paul's waiting driver honked discreetly behind him, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the impossible sight before him. His executive assistant, Vivian, who had been walking 2 steps behind him as always, nearly collided with his suddenly motionless frame. "Mr. Blackwood, is everything all right?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice as she followed his gaze across the street. To anyone else, it would seem absurd. A powerful man worth billions, known for his razor-sharp focus and emotional detachment, paralyzed by the sight of a child's tattered toy. But Vivian had worked for Paul for 15 years, long enough to recognize that something monumentally disruptive had just occurred in her employer's carefully constructed world. Paul didn't respond, couldn't form words as memories he'd buried beneath decades of ambition and achievement came crashing back. The scent of smoke, the heat of flames against his face, the desperate cries of his mother telling him to run, to save himself, and the devastating realization, hours later, that he had nothing left. Not his parents, not his home, not even the stuffed rabbit that had been his constant companion since he was a toddler, the one his mother had lovingly mended dozens of times, the one she had promised would always keep him safe. How could that rabbit, his rabbit, with its distinctive missing ear and familiar patch, possibly be in the hands of a child on a Boston street corner nearly 4 decades later? "I need to speak to that woman and her son," Paul finally said, his voice sounding strange and distant even to his own ears. Without waiting for Vivian's response, he stepped off the curb, narrowly avoiding a taxi that blared its horn in indignation at the jaywalking pedestrian who didn't even flinch at the near miss. The woman at the bus stop, a slender brunette in a worn but neat beige coat, noticed his approach with wary confusion, instinctively pulling her son closer to her side as the imposing man in the $3,000 suit strode purposefully toward them. "Excuse me," Paul said, attempting to soften his typically commanding tone but failing miserably. "That rabbit your son is holding, I need to know where you got it." The woman's wariness instantly transformed into protective hostility. "Excuse me?" she replied, her voice tight with suspicion. "I don't see how that's any of your business, sir." The little boy, seemingly oblivious to the tension between the adults, continued to make the rabbit hop along the edge of the bench, whispering some private adventure narrative to his stuffed companion. Paul's gaze fixed on the toy again, taking in every detail, the particular shade of faded blue, the missing left ear, the distinctive stitching on the patch that he knew, with absolute certainty, had been his mother's handiwork. It was impossible and yet undeniable. This was his Hoppy. Lena Thompson had been having a challenging morning even before the intimidating stranger appeared before her and her son with his bizarre demand about Mick's beloved stuffed rabbit. The ancient water heater in their apartment building had finally given up the ghost, resulting in a freezing cold shower, followed by a frantic search for Mick's left shoe that had made them late for the bus that would take him to school and her to the bookstore where she worked. Now this man, clearly wealthy and clearly used to getting his way, was looming over them with an intensity that set off every alarm bell in Lena's head. But there was something else in his expression too, something beneath the commanding presence. An expensive suit, a vulnerability, a desperate need that didn't match his imposing exterior. Mick has had this rabbit since he was a baby, she explained, her tone still cautious but slightly less hostile. It was given to him by his grandmother. I don't see why. May I? Paul interrupted, extending his hand toward the toy with uncharacteristic uncertainty. Mick, who had been watching the exchange between his mother and the stranger with growing interest, clutched Hoppy tighter to his chest. He's mine, the boy stated firmly, regarding Paul with a direct, unintimidated gaze that was surprisingly similar to the billionaire's own. Paul found himself at a loss, a sensation so foreign it momentarily stunned him into silence. He, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, who had built an empire from nothing through sheer force of will and relentless determination, had no idea how to convince a 7-year-old boy to let him examine a stuffed rabbit. Mick, Lena began, surprising herself with her next words. Maybe we could let the gentleman look at Hoppy for just a moment. She wasn't entirely sure why she was acquiescing to this strange request, except that something in the man's eyes conveyed an urgency that seemed genuine despite its irrationality. Paul's head snapped up at the name. You call him Hoppy? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded slowly, a crease forming between her brows. That's what was sewn onto the tag inside his ear when my mother found him. His name is Hoppy. Paul's composure, the legendary self-control that had made him one of the most formidable figures in international business, cracked visibly. Mick, sensing something significant in the adult's exchange, reluctantly held out the rabbit. You can look, he offered, but be careful. He's very old. With hands that weren't quite steady, Paul gently took the stuffed rabbit, turning it over to examine the remaining right ear. And there it was. A small, faded tag with Hoppy embroidered in his mother's distinctive handwriting, the same careful stitches that had mended the patch on the rabbit's belly countless times over the years. The bus rumbled to a stop beside them, its doors hissing open, but no one moved. I need to know, Paul said, looking back at Lena with an intensity that would have been intimidating if not for the raw emotion now evident in his expression. Where your mother found this rabbit. Please, it's important. Lena hesitated, glancing at the waiting bus, then at her clearly confused son, and finally back at the strange man holding her son's toy, as if it were made of the most delicate crystal. We're going to miss our bus, she said, making a split-second decision. But if you really need to know about the rabbit, you could give us a ride to Mick's school and my work, and I'll tell you what I know. It was a bold request, perhaps even a foolish one given that this man was a complete stranger. But Lena had always prided herself on her ability to read people, and something told her that whatever was happening here was genuinely significant. Paul nodded immediately, relief washing over his features as he carefully handed the rabbit back to Mick. Of course. My car is right over there. He gestured to the sleek black sedan waiting at the curb, its driver standing attentively beside. The open door. Vivian, who had observed the entire exchange from a discreet distance, hurried forward with a questioning look that Paul silently dismissed with a slight shake of his head. This was not a matter for his executive assistant to manage or reschedule. This was something he needed to handle personally, regardless of the 3 critical meetings awaiting him back at Blackwood Tower. My name is Paul Blackwood, he offered, belatedly realizing he hadn't properly introduced himself. Lena's eyes widened slightly in recognition. Even someone who paid as little attention to business news as she did would recognize the name of one of the world's wealthiest men, whose technology and investment company had revolutionized multiple industries over the past 2 decades. "Lena Thompson," she replied, struggling to reconcile the almost vulnerable man before her with the corporate titan whose stern visage occasionally appeared on magazine covers. "And this is my son, Mick." The boy, clutching Hoppy tightly in one hand, extended the other toward Paul with a direct gaze that seemed to challenge the billionaire to be worthy of his trust. Paul found himself smiling, truly smiling. Not the practiced expression he deployed for business negotiations and press conferences, as he shook the small hand with a gentleness that surprised even himself. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mick," he said, then added with unexpected honesty, "You have a very special rabbit there." The boy nodded solemnly. "He keeps me safe from monsters," he confided, as if sharing an important trade secret. "He's very brave, even though he's old and missing an ear." The simple statement hit Paul with unexpected force, transporting him back to his own childhood, when he had whispered the exact same sentiments to his mother, who had smiled and told him that sometimes the bravest heroes were the ones who had survived a few battles and had the scars to prove it. The memory was so vivid, so immediate, that for a moment he could almost smell his mother's perfume. A simple lavender water she had applied sparingly, saying that true elegance never announced itself loudly. The sleek interior of Paul's car was warmer than the damp autumn morning outside, and Mick's initial hesitation quickly dissolved into wide-eyed fascination with the vehicle's luxurious features. "Does this button make the car fly?" he asked, his finger hovering over one of the many controls in the passenger compartment. Paul, who had instructed his driver to take them to Mick's school first, glanced at the boy with amusement. "Not yet," he replied seriously, "but the research and development team is working on it, maybe for the next model." Mick nodded, accepting this as perfectly reasonable, while Lena bit back a smile at the unexpected glimpse of playfulness from the supposedly austere businessman. The brief moment of lightness faded as Paul turned his attention back to her. "Your mother," he prompted gently. "You mentioned she found the rabbit." Lena nodded, gathering her thoughts. "My mother worked as a volunteer with the Red Cross disaster response team back in the 80s, she explained. There was a house fire in a Boston suburb, Lexington, I think. She was part of the team that helped the survivors with immediate needs, clothing, temporary housing, that sort of thing." Paul's breath caught audibly. Lexington. August 17th, 1984, the address that had defined everything that came after. "She found the rabbit in the debris?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Lena nodded, watching his reaction with growing curiosity. "Yes, a few days after the fire. The authorities let the team back in to salvage any personal belongings once the structure was deemed safe enough. Mom found the rabbit caught under some fallen beams. It was dirty and a bit singed, but surprisingly intact. She was going to add it to the box of salvaged items, but..." She paused, struggling to recall the details of a story told to her years ago. But they told her the only survivor was a teenage boy who had already been placed with distant relatives out of state. The salvage box was supposed to be shipped to him, but apparently there was some confusion about the address. The box sat, unclaimed, in some storage facility for months, and by the time anyone followed up, the relatives had moved again without leaving a forwarding address. Paul listened intently, his mind filling in the blanks of what had happened after he had been pulled, screaming and fighting from the smoking ruins of his childhood, the well-meaning but overworked social worker. The hasty placement with his mother's cousin in Rhode Island, a woman he had met only twice before and who had viewed taking him in as a burdensome obligation rather than an act of familial love. The series of moves that followed as his resentful guardian sought better employment opportunities, dragging a silent, traumatized teenager in her wake. "My mother kept the rabbit," Lena continued, thinking that someday she might be able to return it to its owner. But the years passed and... She shrugged. "When I had Mick," She gave it to him. She died about 3 years ago. Her voice softened on these last words, the pain of the loss still evident. She would have been amazed to know it actually found its way back to you. It is yours, isn't it? That's why you recognized it. It wasn't really a question. Lena had seen enough in Paul's expression to know the truth, but she still wanted to hear him say it. Paul nodded, his eyes fixed on the back of the driver's seat, seeing not the fine leather upholstery, but the flames that had consumed his childhood home, and with it, his sense of safety and belonging. Yes, he confirmed softly. Hoppy was mine. My mother made him for me when I was 3. He went everywhere with me until the night of the fire. I was 13. He fell silent, the weight of unspoken memories hanging heavily in the air between them. Mick, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the selective attention typical of a 7-year-old, suddenly tuned back in. Hoppy was yours? He asked, looking at Paul with new interest. When you were little like me? There was something so innocent, so direct in the question, that Paul found himself answering with uncharacteristic openness. Yes, when I was little. My mother made him for me, and she would fix him whenever he got torn or dirty. To his horror, he felt his throat tightening with emotion, threatening to betray him in front of these strangers. Mick seemed to consider this information carefully, his small face scrunched in concentration as he processed this new understanding of his stuffed companion's history. Finally, he looked from Paul to the rabbit and back again. Do you want him back? He asked, the question stunning both adults into momentary silence. Before Paul could formulate a response, the car rolled to a smooth stop in front of an elementary school where children were streaming through the front doors under the watchful eyes of teachers and aides. We're here, buddy, Lena said quickly, grateful for the timely interruption. You're going to be late for Ms. Peterson's class. She helped Mick gather his backpack, then turned to Paul with an apologetic smile. I can answer more of your questions on the way to the bookstore, if that's still okay. Paul nodded, still processing Mick's startling question. Did he want Hoppy back? The rational, adult part of his brain recognized how absurd it was to even contemplate taking a stuffed toy from a child. And yet, the 13-year-old boy still living somewhere inside him, the one who had lost everything in a single night, yearned to reclaim this one tangible connection to his parents and his lost childhood. Mick, seemingly unaware of the emotional turmoil he had unleashed, opened the car door with assistance from the driver who had hurried around to help. But before climbing out, he hesitated, then thrust Hoppy toward Paul. You can hold him during school, he offered magnanimously. But I need him back after, okay, for bedtime. Paul stared at the stuffed rabbit being held out to him, momentarily paralyzed by the gesture. A billionaire CEO being offered joint custody of a tattered stuffed animal by a solemn-faced 7-year-old. It was a scene so incongruous it might have been comical if not for the raw emotion churning beneath it. That's very kind of you, Mick, he managed, his voice rough. But Hoppy should stay with you. He's kept you safe all these years, right? That's his job. The boy considered this seriously, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the logic. Okay, but maybe you can visit him sometimes, if you miss him. With that parting suggestion, he allowed his mother to usher him out of the car and toward the school entrance, the blue rabbit clutched securely under his arm. Paul watched them go, feeling as though something momentous had just occurred, though he couldn't quite define what it was. As Lena returned to the car, sliding into the seat across from him, Paul realized with a start that he had completely lost track of his schedule for the day. He, who lived by 15-minute increments carefully managed by Vivian, had no idea what meetings he was missing or what calls were going unanswered. More surprisingly, he found he didn't particularly care. The Cornerstone bookshop on Marlborough Street, he instructed his driver, remembering Lena's workplace from their earlier conversation. Then, turning to her, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since their extraordinary encounter began. Your mother, did she ever mention anything about the family? About what happened to them? The question was unnecessary. Paul knew exactly what had happened. His father, who had always been a sound sleeper, had not awakened when the fire started in the faulty wiring of their aging home. His mother had managed to reach Paul's room, to shake him awake and push him toward the window even as the smoke grew thicker. "I'll be right behind you," she had promised. But she had gone back for his father, and neither of them had emerged from the inferno that followed. Lena's expression softened with compassion. She mentioned that the parents didn't make it, she said gently, and that the son, you, were the only survivor. That's part of why she kept the rabbit, I think. She said sometimes after losing everything, having just one familiar thing to hold on to can make all the difference. Paul nodded, unable to speak for a moment. That was exactly what he had needed in those first terrible days and weeks after. The fire. Something familiar. Something that connected him to the life and the people he had lost. Instead, he had been given a garbage bag containing donated clothes in approximately the right size, a few generic toiletries, and a well-meant but utterly inadequate pat on the shoulder from a social worker handling too many cases with too few resources. Your mother was a wise woman, he finally said. That's exactly what the rabbit would have meant to me then. The revelation hung between them, creating an unexpected intimacy despite their brief acquaintance. Lena studied the man across from her with new understanding. The imperious billionaire CEO was still there in his impeccable suit and commanding presence. But now she could also see the orphaned boy who had lost everything, including his beloved stuffed rabbit, and had rebuilt himself into someone too powerful to ever be that vulnerable again. It explained so much about the public persona of Paul Blackwood, the ruthless business tactics, the famously solitary lifestyle, the massive fortune that seemed to be an end in itself rather than a means to any particular enjoyment. "What happened to you after the fire?" she asked quietly, sensing he might be willing to share more of his story now that the initial shock of seeing Hoppy had begun to fade. Paul's gaze shifted to the window, watching the familiar streets of Boston slide by as the car moved smoothly through the morning traffic. It was a story he had never told anyone, not in full, not even to the handful of therapists he had reluctantly seen over the years at the insistence of concerned colleagues. "I was sent to live with my mother's cousin in Rhode Island," he began, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were reciting someone else's biography rather than his own. She was unprepared for the responsibility. She did what was legally required, but nothing more. We moved several times over the next few years as she pursued better job opportunities. I focused on school. It was the one thing I could control. He paused, his mouth twisting in a humorless smile. I was determined to get scholarships, to get out, to build something that couldn't be taken from me. By 16, I was working nights and weekends, saving every penny. I got into MIT with a full ride, moved back to Boston, and never looked back. The bare bones account omitted so much. The nights spent staring at the ceiling in a series of unfamiliar rooms, the relentless drive that had alienated him from peers who were still enjoying normal teenage concerns, the gradual hardening of his heart against attachment of any kind. But it was more than he had shared with anyone in decades. Lena listened without interruption, sensing both what was said and what remained unspoken. "And you succeeded," she observed softly. "You built something that couldn't be taken from you." Paul nodded, his expression a complex mixture of pride and something darker, more melancholy. "Blackwood Enterprises has a market capitalization of $87 billion, he confirmed, the staggering number delivered without inflection. "We employ over 40,000 people worldwide. Our technologies are used in everything from medical devices to satellite systems." The litany of achievements sounded hollow, even to his own ears. a resume recitation rather than a life well lived. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what his parents would think of what he had built, what he had become. His father, a high school science teacher with a passion for space exploration, would have been fascinated by the aerospace division of Blackwood Enterprises. His mother, a part-time librarian who believed that stories were as essential as food, might have been less impressed by the corporate empire than by the man behind it. And what would she see looking at him now? A success by any material measure. And yet. The car slowed to a stop in front of a charming storefront, with bay windows, displaying artfully arranged books and comfortable reading nooks visible within. The Cornerstone bookshop looked like something from another era, a place where literature was revered rather than merely consumed, where customers might be encouraged to linger rather than simply complete a transaction. It suited what Paul was beginning to understand about Lena, her thoughtfulness, her direct manner layered over genuine compassion. "This is me," she said, reaching for the door handle. Then she hesitated, turning back to face him. "Look, I don't know what finding Hoppy means to you after all these years, but Mick and I are usually at Linden Park on Saturday afternoons around 2. If you wanted to see the rabbit again, or maybe just talk more about your parents or what happened, well, we'll be there." The invitation was offered casually, but Paul could sense the empathy behind it. This woman he had known for less than an hour, somehow understanding that he needed more closure than a brief conversation in the back of a luxury car could provide. "Thank you," he replied, surprised by how much he meant it. "I appreciate the offer. And the information about Hoppy, it's been unexpectedly meaningful." The words were inadequate, but Lena seemed to understand what he couldn't quite express. She smiled, a genuine warm expression that transformed her already attractive features into something genuinely beautiful. "Kids have a way of seeing what matters," she said simply. "I've learned a lot from watching Mick navigate the world with his heart wide open. Maybe there's something to be said for keeping a bit of that childhood vulnerability, even as adults." With that profound observation casually delivered, she slipped out of the car and into the bookshop, leaving Paul to contemplate her words as his driver waited patiently for new instructions. The rest of Paul's day passed in a blur of meetings he attended physically, while his mind remained fixated on the morning's extraordinary encounter. Vivian, with her characteristic efficiency, had rearranged his schedule to accommodate his unexpected detour, but even she had been startled by the change in her employer's demeanor. For a man notorious for his laser focus on business matters, Paul Blackwood was uncharacteristically distracted, several times having to ask colleagues to repeat information he would normally have absorbed instantly. "Are you feeling well, Mr. Blackwood?" Vivian finally asked as she delivered a stack of contracts requiring his signature late that afternoon. "You seem preoccupied." Paul glanced up from the document he hadn't really been reading, momentarily considering how to respond. The truth, that he had been emotionally upended by the discovery of a tattered stuffed rabbit from his childhood, seemed too personal, too vulnerable to share even with his trusted assistant of 15 years. "I've had some unexpected news," he said finally, settling for a partial truth. "Nothing concerning for the business, just personal matters that require some attention." Vivian nodded, accepting this vague explanation with professional discretion. "Of course. Should I clear some time in your schedule for these personal matters?" The question was delivered without inflection, but Paul caught the subtle note of concern beneath Vivian's composed exterior. She had dedicated her career to anticipating his needs, to ensuring that nothing disrupted the smooth operation of his professional life. And yet here he was, contemplating a spontaneous visit to a public park on a Saturday afternoon to see a boy and his stuffed rabbit, a disruption to his routine that his younger self would have dismissed as sentimental nonsense. "Yes," he heard himself saying, surprising them both. "Keep Saturday afternoon open, and postpone the Tokyo video conference. We'll reschedule for Monday morning." That evening, alone in his penthouse apartment with its sweeping views of Boston Harbor, Paul found himself doing something he had avoided for decades, actively remembering his childhood. Not just the tragedy that had ended it, but the ordinary moments that had preceded the fire. His father patiently explaining the constellations from their modest backyard. His mother reading aloud from books slightly too advanced for him, building his vocabulary and his love of stories. Family dinners, around their scratched wooden table, where the conversation had been deemed more important than the simple food. And Hoppy, always Hoppy, tucked under his arm at bedtime, keeping the nightmares at bay with his one-eared vigilance. These memories, long suppressed in his relentless drive forward, now rose to the surface with painful clarity, demanding acknowledgement. Paul poured himself a glass of scotch, an expensive single malt that he drank more out of habit than enjoyment, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering city below. Somewhere out there, in some modest apartment he couldn't see from his rarefied height, a little boy named Mick was probably getting ready for bed, clutching a blue rabbit that had once been Paul's most treasured possession. The realization that Hoppy had continued his protective duties with another child brought an unexpected sense of rightness. As if the rabbit's journey from his childhood through Lena's mother's rescue to Mick's small hands was somehow meant to be a continuation of something important rather than a random coincidence. Paul had built his empire on rational analysis and strategic calculation. He had no patience for concepts, like fate or destiny. And yet he couldn't deny the extraordinary odds against this particular stuffed animal, finding its way back into his awareness after nearly 4 decades, or the profound impact of that discovery on his carefully controlled emotional landscape. He took a sip of the scotch, grimacing slightly at the taste he had never truly developed a fondness for despite its prestigious label. Another habit adopted because it was expected of someone in his position, rather than because it brought him any genuine pleasure. How many other elements of his life fell into that same category? The thought was disturbing enough that he set the glass aside, unfinished. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, a last breath of summer before autumn settled in earnest over New England. Paul spent an inordinate amount of time considering what to wear for a casual visit to a public park. His usual business attire seemed absurdly formal, while the limited selection of casual clothing he owned felt foreign after so many years of suits and ties. He finally settled on dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, an outfit that his mirror informed him looked both expensive and slightly uncomfortable, like a costume he hadn't quite mastered. At precisely 1:45, his driver delivered him to the edge of Linden Park, where families were already enjoying the unexpected gift of warm weather. Paul instructed the man to return in an hour, then stood for a moment, scanning the playground area for a familiar small figure with a blue rabbit. The knot of anxiety in his stomach, a sensation he typically associated with major acquisitions or shareholder confrontations, not social interactions, tightened when he didn't immediately spot Lena or Mick among the scattered groups of parents and children. "You came?" a voice observed from behind him, and Paul turned to find Lena watching him with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been approval. She looked different today, dressed in faded jeans and a simple green sweater that brought out the hazel flecks in her eyes, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, rather than pulled back in the practical style she had worn on Tuesday. "I wasn't entirely sure you would," she admitted, gesturing toward a nearby bench. "Billionaire CEOs probably have more important things to do on Saturday afternoons than visit playgrounds." There was no edge to her words, just a candid acknowledgement of the unlikely nature of his presence. Paul followed her to the bench, strangely grateful for her direct approach. "Billionaire CEOs generally do," he agreed with unexpected self-deprecation. "But I'm finding that recently discovered former owners of one-eared rabbits have different priorities." This attempt at humor, a rusty skill he rarely deployed, earned him a genuine smile that transformed Lena's features from pretty to radiant. "Mick's over there," she said, pointing toward a complex climbing structure where her son was navigating the monkey bars with intense concentration, Hoppy patiently waiting on a platform nearby. "He'll be ecstatic that you came. He's been telling everyone who will listen about the man who used to own Hoppy when he was little." She glanced at Paul, amusement dancing in her eyes. "I had to explain to his teacher that he hadn't given his favorite toy to a random stranger, since that was apparently his first excited but garbled version of the story." Paul found himself smiling in response, his second genuine smile in a week after years of the practiced version he deployed for business purposes. "I hope I haven't complicated things for him. Or for you," he said, suddenly aware that his unexpected appearance in their lives might have consequences beyond his own emotional journey. Lena shook her head. "Are you kidding? You've made his week. It's not every day that his rabbit turns out to have a secret history with a real-life billionaire. In Mick's world, that's practically a superhero origin story." As if summoned by the discussion, Mick spotted them from his perch on the climbing structure and immediately began his descent, pausing only to carefully collect Hoppy before racing toward them with the boundless energy of childhood. "You came!" he exclaimed, skidding to a stop in front of Paul with the rabbit clutched triumphantly in one hand. "Mom said you might be too busy with your important business stuff, but I told her you'd come see Hoppy again." The boy's unfiltered delight was infectious, and Paul found himself responding with a warmth that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten its existence. "I wouldn't miss it," he assured Mick seriously. "And you're right. Seeing Hoppy again is more important than my business meetings." The words were offered as a simple gesture to please a child, but as he spoke them, Paul realized with a jolt that they were absolutely true. This moment, sitting on a park bench with a woman he barely knew and a boy holding a stuffed rabbit from his long-lost childhood, felt more meaningful than any corporate achievement in recent memory. Mick clambered onto the bench between them, apparently taking Paul's presence as an established fact, rather than the extraordinary deviation from routine that it represented. "Hoppy wanted to know if you remember when he lost his ear," the boy announced, examining the rabbit's missing appendage with professional interest. "I told him it was probably a very exciting story with bad guys or maybe pirates." The question caught Paul off guard, not because it was invasive, but because he had forgotten that particular detail until this moment. The memory surfaced with unexpected clarity, his father helping him search the backyard after a particularly enthusiastic game of catch had separated Hoppy from his left ear. The two of them on hands and knees in the gathering dusk, finally locating the small piece of blue fabric just as his mother called them in for dinner. Her skilled hands carefully removing the damaged ear entirely, explaining that sometimes when things couldn't be fixed perfectly, they could still be made whole in a different way. It wasn't quite as exciting as pirates, Paul admitted to Mick, his voice softer than usual. "It was an accident during a game of catch with my dad. My mother decided Hoppy could be just as brave with one ear as with two." Mick considered this information with solemn attention, clearly filing it away as an important addition to Hoppy's personal history. "Your mom was right," he declared after a moment's reflection. "Hoppy is very brave. He chases away all the monsters under my bed." He patted the rabbit's worn head with a gentle hand that belied his energetic nature. "And he's real good at keeping secrets, too. I tell him all the important ones." This matter-of-fact confidence in the stuffed animal's protective abilities stirred something deep in Paul's chest, a memory of his own childhood certainty that Hoppy possessed magic beyond the understanding of adults. He had whispered his fears and dreams to those worn blue ears countless times, believing with absolute conviction that the rabbit would keep his confidences sacred and his nightmares at bay. That same innocent faith now shone in Mick's eyes as he gazed at his treasured companion, and Paul found himself envying the child's unguarded heart, even as he marveled at its resilience. "He always was an excellent confidant," Paul agreed, matching Mick's serious tone. "I told him all my secrets, too, when I was your age." This shared understanding seemed to solidify something between them, an unexpected bond forged through their mutual appreciation of Hoppy's unique qualities. Mick nodded, then glanced at his mother before leaning slightly toward Paul as if about to impart something of great importance. "Mom said Hoppy was all you had left from when you were little," he stage whispered, his expression earnest. "That there was a fire and your mom and dad went to heaven." The innocent phrasing of the tragedy that had defined Paul's life momentarily robbed him of speech. He was accustomed to discussions of the fire in clinical terms, insurance investigations, legal proceedings, the dry language of police and fire reports. To hear it described in the gentle, direct language of childhood struck him at his core, temporarily stripping away the protective layers he had built over decades. Lena placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Mick, remember we talked about how some questions might make Mr. Blackwood sad? That was a very big, hard thing that happened to him." The boy's face fell, and he twisted his fingers anxiously in Hoppy's worn fur. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, genuine distress evident in his downturned mouth. "I didn't mean to make you sad." Paul found himself reaching out instinctively to reassure the child, surprising both himself and Lena with the natural gesture. "You didn't make me sad, Mick," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "What happened was a long time ago, and yes, it was very hard. But finding Hoppy again and meeting you and your mom, that has made me happy." The word felt strange on his tongue, a concept so rarely applied to his own emotional state that it seemed almost foreign. And yet it was true. Beneath the complex swirl of memories and grief stirred by Hoppy's reappearance, there was a thread of genuine joy, a reconnection to something vital that had been missing for too long. Mick's expression brightened at this reassurance. "So it's like Hoppy found you again," he declared triumphantly. "Just like in the stories where lost things come back when they're supposed to." Paul exchanged a glance with Lena over the boy's head, finding in her eyes a sympathetic understanding that required no words. "Something like that," he agreed softly. "Though I think he's been exactly where he needed to be all this time, taking care of you." The generosity of this sentiment clearly pleased Mick, who nodded vigorously. "He's very good at taking care," he confirmed. "But maybe." He hesitated, a furrow appearing between his small brows as he worked through some complex internal calculation. "Maybe he could visit you sometimes, so you don't miss him too much." The innocent offer, so selflessly extended from a child who clearly treasured the rabbit, touched Paul in a place he had thought long since armored against such sentiment. "That's very kind of you, Mick," he replied, careful to match the boy's serious tone rather than responding with the condescending amusement many adults would have offered. "But I think Hoppy belongs with you. He has a very important job keeping those monsters away after all." What he didn't say, couldn't articulate even to himself, was that seeing Hoppy again had already accomplished something significant within him. The rabbit wasn't just a nostalgic relic of his lost childhood. It was a tangible reminder of who he had been before tragedy and ambition had hardened him into the man he had become. That reminder would remain whether or not the physical toy was in his possession. Mick seemed to accept this logic, though his expression remained thoughtful as he glanced between Paul and the rabbit. "Okay," he said finally. "But you can still come see him, if you want." Paul found himself nodding, despite the voice of practicality in his head pointing out that regular visits to a public park to see a child and his stuffed rabbit hardly fit into the carefully regimented schedule of a CEO managing a global enterprise. The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease, the initial awkwardness of their unusual connection giving way to more natural conversation. Mick, having settled the important matters regarding Hoppy's visitation rights, darted back to the playground with the boundless energy of childhood, though he returned periodically to check on the adults, and perhaps to reassure himself that Paul hadn't disappeared. In these moments of privacy, Paul found himself sharing more of his history with Lena than he had intended, drawn out by her thoughtful questions and genuine interest. "After the fire, I became focused," he explained, watching Mick navigate a complex climbing structure with Hoppy tucked securely under his arm. "Education was my ticket out of dependency, Then business became I suppose you could call it my armor. He hadn't framed it quite that way before, even to himself, but as the words emerged, he recognized their truth. Every dollar earned, every company acquired, every competitor outmaneuvered. They all reinforced the walls between me and another devastating loss. Lena listened without interruption, her gaze steady and compassionate, without the pity he had always dreaded. "And did it work?" she asked finally. "The armor, did it protect you from loss?" The question was gentle but direct, cutting to the heart of his carefully constructed life with unsettling accuracy. Paul considered it with the same analytical rigor he applied to business decisions, weighing the evidence dispassionately. "It protected me from certain kinds of vulnerability," he acknowledged slowly. "But at a cost I'm only beginning to recognize." The admission felt dangerously close to something he had never voiced aloud. The growing emptiness that success had never managed to fill. The hollow center of achievements that impressed the world, but left him increasingly disconnected from any genuine sense of fulfillment. Lena nodded, her expression suggesting she understood more than he had explicitly stated. "Loss reshapes us," she said softly. "When Mick's father walked out during my pregnancy, I decided that self-sufficiency was the only safe option. No more dependencies, no more trusting someone else with our well-being." The parallel between their experiences struck Paul with unexpected force, both of them constructing defensive systems against further hurt, though in very different forms. "And yet you raised Mick to be so open," he observed, watching the boy cheerfully offering Hoppy to a smaller child who had been eyeing the rabbit with fascination. "He doesn't seem guarded at all." Lena's smile held a mixture of pride and wistfulness. "That's been the greatest gift and the greatest challenge of motherhood," she admitted. "Watching him approach the world with his heart wide open, when every protective instinct in me wants to teach him caution." She turned slightly on the bench to face Paul more directly. "But I realized something important along the way. Safety isn't the absence of risk. It's having the resilience to recover when things go wrong. Mick knows I'm here, no matter what. That security allows him to be brave in ways I'm still learning." The profound wisdom in her simple statement resonated deeply with Paul. His entire adult life had been structured around the elimination of risk, financial, emotional, personal. The impulse that had driven him to build Blackwood Enterprises into an impregnable fortress had been the same one that had kept him isolated from meaningful connections, always in control, never vulnerable to the kind of devastating loss he had experienced as a child. And where had that left him? Materially secure beyond most people's wildest dreams, but sitting on a park bench, envying a 7-year-old boy's capacity for open-hearted engagement with the world. The irony was not lost on him. "Your mother gave Hoppy to Mick," he said after a thoughtful pause. "But she kept him all those years, hoping to return him to his original owner someday. That's a remarkably optimistic perspective given how unlikely such a reunion would be." Lena's expression softened at the mention of her mother. Mom was like that, stubbornly hopeful in the face of impossible odds. She used to say that hope wasn't about statistical probability. It was about keeping a door open for possibilities that rational analysis would dismiss. She glanced toward the playground where Mick was now organizing some complex game involving Hoppy and several other children, his natural leadership apparent even from a distance. "I try to remember that lesson when my practical side starts closing doors too quickly. Sometimes the improbable happens anyway, against all rational expectation." As if to illustrate her point, she gestured between them. "I mean, what were the odds that Mick would be at that particular bus stop, with that particular stuffed rabbit, at the exact moment you happened to walk by?" Astronomical, I would think. Paul, who had built his fortune on calculating probabilities and mitigating unlikely scenarios, couldn't argue with her assessment. Their meeting defied statistical likelihood to such a degree that, had he been prone to superstition, he might have been tempted to ascribe meaning to it. As the afternoon began to wane, casting long shadows across the park, Paul checked his watch and realized with surprise that nearly 2 hours had passed in what had felt like moments. His driver would be waiting patiently at the designated pickup point, probably wondering what mysterious engagement had captured his employer's attention for so long. "I should be going," he said, reluctance evident in his tone, despite his attempt at professional detachment. "I have some work to review before Monday." It was true, but also a convenient excuse, a retreat to familiar territory after an afternoon of unexpected emotional exposure. Lena nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. Thank you for coming. It meant a lot to Mick." She hesitated, then added with a directness that he was coming to appreciate as characteristic, "And I enjoyed our conversation as well." The simple acknowledgement carried no pressure, no expectation beyond the present moment, and yet Paul found himself oddly reluctant to let her, go. "I did as well," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "This has been unlike anything in my usual routine." The understatement drew a small laugh from Lena, the sound warm and genuine in the autumn air. "I imagine billionaire CEOs don't typically spend their Saturdays discussing stuffed rabbits and philosophical approaches to risk management with bookstore managers and 7-year-olds, she agreed, her eyes twinkling with gentle humor. Paul smiled, his third genuine smile in a single week, a personal record in recent memory. "Their loss," he responded, the words emerging before he could subject them to his usual careful filtering process. The spontaneous reply clearly pleased Lena, whose smile widened as she called to Mick that it was time to leave. The boy came racing over, Hoppy clutched firmly in one hand, his face flushed with exercise and excitement. "Are you leaving?" he asked Paul, disappointment evident in his expressive features. "But you just got here." Paul found himself kneeling to address the child at eye level, another instinctive gesture that would have shocked anyone who knew him in his professional capacity. "I'm afraid I have to go, but I've had a wonderful time," he said sincerely. "Thank you for letting me see Hoppy again, and for taking such good care of him all these years." Mick nodded solemnly, clearly recognizing the gravity of his rabbit custodian responsibilities. "He liked seeing you too," he confided, holding the stuffed animal up for inspection. "See? He's smiling." Paul studied the worn face of his childhood companion, the stitched mouth that had always seemed to him to hold a slight upward curve regardless of circumstances. "I believe you're right," he agreed seriously. Then, acting on impulse rather than calculation for perhaps the first time in decades, he asked, "Would it be all right if I visited again sometime?" "To see both of you?" The question was directed at Mick, but Paul was acutely aware of Lena standing just behind her son, her expression a complex mixture of surprise and something warmer, more intriguing. Mick's face lit up with unrestrained delight. "Yes, you could come to the park again, or..." He turned to his mother with sudden inspiration. "Or he could come for dinner, right, Mom? Like when Grandma used to come, with the special plates." The suggestion clearly caught Lena off guard, a faint blush coloring her cheeks as she met Paul's gaze over her son's head. "Mick, Mr. Blackwood is a very busy man," she began, diplomatic but firm. "I'm sure he doesn't have time for..." "I'd like that," Paul interrupted, the words emerging with a certainty that startled him as much as it did Lena. "If the invitation is open, of course." Their eyes held for a long moment, an unspoken communication passing between them, her surprise giving way to cautious interest, his own expression conveying a sincerity he hoped was evident despite his relative inexperience with such personal overtures. "Well," Lena said finally, her composure returning though the blush lingered attractively on her cheeks. "I suppose we could arrange something, if you're serious." Her tone carried just enough doubt to suggest she wasn't entirely convinced this wasn't simply polite acquiescence to a child's impulsive invitation. Paul straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "I am," he confirmed, surprised by how much he meant it. "My schedule is..." flexible. This last statement was perhaps the most significant untruth he had uttered in years. His schedule was infamous for being booked weeks in advance with precisely calibrated efficiency. But in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he would rearrange whatever was necessary to accept this invitation. Lena studied him for another moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with whatever she saw in his expression. "Tuesday evening," she suggested. "Around 6:30? Nothing fancy, just a home-cooked meal." The casual description belied the extraordinary nature of the invitation. Paul Blackwood, whose dining experiences typically involved Michelin-starred restaurants or catered business functions, being welcomed into a modest home for a family dinner. "I'll bring dessert," he offered, grasping for the appropriate social protocol for such a situation. This seemed to amuse Lena, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "All right, we're on Maple Street, 455, apartment 3B. She hesitated, then added with gentle humor, "Though I imagine with your resources, you could have found that information without much difficulty." The teasing reference to his wealth and influence, delivered without resentment or awe, was refreshingly direct after years of people either fawning over his status or pretending with transparent falseness not to be impressed by it. "Thank you," Paul said simply, acknowledging both the invitation and the unspoken acceptance it represented. "I'll see you Tuesday." Mick, who had been following this adult exchange with keen interest, thrust Hoppy forward for a final farewell. "Say bye to Hoppy," he instructed, clearly expecting compliance even from a billionaire CEO. Paul obliged, gently touching the worn blue paw extended toward him. "Goodbye, Hoppy. Take good care of Mick." The childish gesture should have felt ridiculous, and yet somehow it didn't. It felt like the completion of a circle, the acknowledgement of a connection that transcended time and tragedy. As Paul walked away from the park, heading toward the waiting car with its patient driver, he was conscious of a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. A lightness, a subtle shift in his emotional landscape that felt both foreign and vaguely familiar. It took several moments of analytical self-examination before he recognized it as something he hadn't experienced in decades. Anticipation. Not the strategic anticipation of business opportunities or competitive advantages, but something more personal, more vulnerable. He was looking forward to Tuesday evening with an eagerness that had nothing to do with professional advancement or material gain. The realization was simultaneously disturbing and exhilarating, a crack in the carefully constructed armor he had maintained for so long, allowing something warmer and more vital to seep through. The intervening days passed with excruciating slowness, despite Paul's packed schedule of meetings, calls, and strategic planning sessions. He found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Lena's direct gaze and thoughtful observations, to Mick's unguarded enthusiasm and the worn blue rabbit that had somehow bridged past and present in ways he was still struggling to fully comprehend. On Monday afternoon, he surprised Vivian by requesting a 2-hour block of personal time for Tuesday evening, an unprecedented deviation from his usual practice of working until at least 8 o'clock on weeknights. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she responded, her professional composure masking her curiosity about this sudden change in routine. "Should I arrange for a car?" Paul considered the question, weighing practicality against instinct. "No," he decided finally. "I'll drive myself." This additional departure from his normal habits, he rarely drove in the city, preferring to use the time in transit for calls or review of documents, raised Vivian's eyebrows fractionally, but she made no comment beyond a neutral acknowledgement. Tuesday evening found Paul standing outside a modest apartment building in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston, feeling more nervous than he had before presenting to the board of directors during Blackwood Enterprises' initial public offering. He had changed from his business suit into more casual attire, dark slacks and a blue cashmere sweater that his personal shopper had assured him was appropriate for informal social occasions, though he had rarely found occasion to wear it. In one hand, He carried a white bakery box from a renowned Boston patisserie, containing an assortment of desserts he had selected with unexpected care after realizing he had no idea what Lena or Mick might prefer. The building's security was minimal, a simple intercom system that buzzed him in after Lena's voice acknowledged his arrival. And as he climbed the 2 flights of stairs to her apartment, Paul found himself increasingly aware of how far this environment was from the rarefied spaces he typically occupied. Mick answered his knock with enthusiastic promptness, Hoppy tucked securely under one arm. "You came," the boy exclaimed, his delight suggesting he had harbored some doubt about whether the billionaire would actually appear for a simple dinner in their modest apartment. "Mom's in the kitchen finishing the pasta, and I set the table with the special napkins that are cloth, not paper. And Hoppy has his own chair, but he doesn't actually eat the food because he's stuffed already. That's a joke Mom tells." The stream of information was delivered without pause for breath, and Paul found himself smiling at the child's transparent excitement. "Thank you for the thorough briefing," he replied gravely, though his eyes held warmth that belied his formal tone. "I brought dessert, as requested." He held up the bakery box, which Mick eyed with the universal appreciation of a child anticipating sweets. "Is it chocolate?" he asked hopefully. "There's some chocolate," Paul confirmed, "and some other options as well. I wasn't sure what you and your mother might prefer." Lena appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her smile welcoming if slightly self-conscious. "Sorry about the interrogation," she said, gesturing toward her son with fond exasperation. "Our social events tend to be limited to his school friends' birthday parties these days, so a grown-up guest is cause for considerable excitement." She was dressed simply in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, yet Paul found himself thinking she looked more genuinely appealing than the carefully cultivated beauty of the socialites and models who typically populated his infrequent social engagements. "Please, come in," she continued, gesturing toward the apartment's small living area. "Dinner's almost ready. Nothing elaborate. Just pasta with my grandmother's secret sauce recipe." The self-deprecating description was delivered with a confidence that suggested she knew, regardless of simplicity, the meal would be satisfying, another refreshing departure from the pretension Paul typically encountered. The apartment was modest but welcoming, a living room with comfortably worn furniture, bookshelves overflowing with an eclectic mix of literature, and walls adorned with what appeared to be mixed artwork displayed with the same reverence a museum might afford to recognized masterpieces. It was a home in the truest sense of the word, lived in and personalized in ways that made Paul suddenly conscious of the sterile perfection of his own penthouse with its professionally designed interior that could have been featured in an architectural magazine but contained nothing of his personality or history. "You have a lovely home," he said, the conventional phrase emerging with unexpected sincerity. Lena's smile suggested she understood both the politeness of the comment and the genuine appreciation behind it. "It's small, but it suits us," she replied without apology or defensive justification. "We've made it our own." Dinner proved to be a revelation, not for the food itself, though the pasta was indeed excellent, but for the easy intimacy of the experience. Mick dominated the conversation with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood, regaling Paul with elaborate stories about school, his friends, and the many adventures of Hoppy, who occupied his promised place at the table in a chair augmented with several cushions. Lena occasionally redirected her son's more tangential narratives, or gently reminded him to allow their guest to eat, but otherwise allowed the natural flow of his excitement. Paul found himself contributing to the conversation more than he had anticipated, drawn out by Mick's direct questions and Lena's thoughtful follow-ups. He shared sanitized anecdotes from his college days at MIT, described the early years of building his company, and even found himself recounting some of the more humorous mishaps from his global business travels, stories he rarely thought about, much less shared. And that's how I ended up delivering a major presentation to Japanese investors, with my suit jacket concealing the fact that a local monkey had stolen my briefcase and shredded my shirt during what was supposed to be a brief cultural visit to a temple, he concluded one such tale, surprised by Mick's peals of laughter and Lena's amused smile. The investors never knew, but my executive assistant has never let me hear the end of it. The ability to laugh at himself, to share a story in which he appeared less than perfectly composed and in control, felt like exercise for emotional muscles long unused, simultaneously uncomfortable and invigorating. Lena's appreciative chuckle suggested she recognized both the humor in the anecdote and the significance of his willingness to share it. "I imagine there aren't many people who get to see that side of the great Paul Blackwood," she observed, her tone warm rather than mocking. "The business magazines certainly present a more intimidating figure." Paul acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. "The business world responds to strength and certainty," he said, more candidly than he had intended. "Vulnerability is interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites predators. It's not so different from the playground, just with higher stakes and better suits." The observation emerged from decades of hard-earned experience, yet as he spoke the words aloud, he found himself questioning their universal application for perhaps the first time. Lena considered this thoughtfully as she refilled their water glasses. "There's strength in vulnerability too," she suggested. "The courage to be seen as you are, not just as you wish to be perceived." The philosophical exchange might have continued, but Mick, who had been showing remarkable patience during this adult conversation, interjected with the priority only a child could muster. "Can we have dessert now? Hoppy wants to know what's in the fancy box." The dessert selection proved to be a unanimous success, with Mick's eyes widening comically at the array of pastries and cakes revealed when Paul opened the bakery box. "Are these all for us?" the boy asked incredulously, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected bounty. "I thought maybe just one cupcake or something." Lena shot Paul a look that mingled amusement with mild reproach for the extravagance, but he merely shrugged, oddly pleased by the child's transparent delight. "I wasn't sure what you would like," he explained simply, "so I brought some options." This understatement of what was clearly a comprehensive sampling of the patisserie's finest offerings drew a laugh from Lena, the sound warm and genuine in the cozy kitchen. "When in doubt, buy one of everything," she teased gently. "Is that the billionaire approach to dessert selection?" The good-natured ribbing about his wealth, delivered without resentment or false deference, was refreshingly direct after years of people either fawning over his status or pretending with transparent falseness not to be impressed by it. "Occupational hazard," Paul admitted with unexpected self-deprecation. "When you're accustomed to solving problems with resources, you tend to over-resource even the simplest challenges." The flash of self-awareness surprised him as much as it seemed to please Lena, whose expression softened into something warmer, more appreciative. "Well, in this case, your problem-solving approach is going to make a certain second grader extremely happy," she noted, watching as Mick carefully examined each dessert with the serious concentration of a jeweler appraising precious stones. "Though I'm going to have to insist he choose just one for tonight. The sugar crash from multiple pastries is not something I care to manage on a school night." Paul nodded, accepting this parental wisdom without question, though he was privately amused by the thought of his executive team observing their notoriously demanding CEO deferring so readily to a bookstore manager's assessment of appropriate dessert allocation. The evening progressed with unexpected ease, the initial awkwardness of their unusual connection giving way to more natural interaction. After dessert, Mick insisted on showing Paul his room, a small space dominated by bookshelves and a desk, covered with art supplies, the walls decorated with a mixture of space posters and the boy's own drawings. "And this is where Hoppy sleeps," he explained, pointing to a small area on his bed that had been carefully arranged with what appeared to be a miniature pillow and blanket sized perfectly for the stuffed rabbit. "He has to be right here so he can watch the door for monsters, but also close enough to tell me stories." The matter-of-fact explanation of this childhood logic transported Paul back to his own boyhood, when he had arranged his bed in exactly the same way, positioning Hoppy for optimal monster surveillance while maintaining proper storytelling proximity. "That's exactly where I used to keep him too," Paul confided, the shared childhood experience creating an unexpected bond across the decades separating their experiences. Hoppy was always very good at Monster Patrol. Mick nodded solemnly, clearly pleased by this confirmation of his rabbit's consistent protective abilities. Did he tell you stories too? The boy asked curiously. When you were little like me? The innocent question triggered a cascade of memories. Nights when Paul had lain awake, whispering his hopes and fears to the stuffed rabbit as if it could somehow make sense of the complicated world of adults, could translate and simplify it into something manageable for a child's understanding. He did, Paul confirmed softly. Sometimes about adventures we might have one day. Sometimes about the stars and planets my father had shown me through his telescope. Hoppy was a very good listener. Something in his tone must have conveyed more emotion than he intended, because Mick studied him with the direct, unfiltered perception that children sometimes bring to bear on adults. You miss your mom and dad a lot, don't you? He asked simply, even though it was a long time ago. The question, so straightforward, so devoid of the careful avoidance most adults would have employed, momentarily robbed Paul of speech. He was accustomed to discussions of the fire in clinical terms, insurance investigations, legal proceedings, the dry language of police and fire reports. To hear it addressed in the gentle, direct language of childhood struck him at his core, temporarily stripping away the protective layers he had built over decades. Yes, he admitted finally, his voice rougher than usual. I miss them very much, even after all this time. The confession, so simple yet so profound, felt like removing a heavy garment he had worn for so long, he had forgotten it wasn't part of himself. Mick nodded with the wisdom sometimes granted to children who have not yet learned to complicate emotional truths with adult rationalizations. That's how Mom feels about Grandma, he observed. She says the missing never really goes away, but it gets easier to carry. He paused, considering this adult concept with careful attention. Like how my backpack was super heavy when I first started school, but now I'm stronger so it doesn't feel as heavy, even though it has more books. The pure, unfiltered compassion. In this observation, the attempt to connect with Paul's ancient grief through his own limited experience was simultaneously heart-wrenching and healing in ways Paul could not have anticipated. Your mother is very wise, he said softly. And so are you, Mick. The compliment was delivered with absolute sincerity, earning him a pleased smile from the boy who clearly registered the genuine respect behind the words. Their conversation was gently interrupted by Lena appearing in the doorway, her expression suggesting she had overheard at least part of their exchange. Bath time, buddy, she announced, her tone firm but gentle. School tomorrow, remember? Mick's immediate protest was clearly a well-established part of their evening routine, delivered with more habit than conviction. But Mom, I'm showing Mr. Blackwood my room and my space books and Mr. Blackwood understands that even future astronauts need their sleep, Lena countered smoothly, her gaze meeting Paul's with a spark of shared amusement at her son's transparent, delaying tactics. To his own surprise, Paul found himself supporting her parental authority without hesitation. Your mother's right, he confirmed seriously. All the astronauts I've met through our aerospace division are very disciplined about their rest schedules. It's an essential part of their training. This appeal to professional astronautical practice appeared to carry significant weight with Mick, who reluctantly conceded the point with a sigh of exaggerated patience. Okay, but can you come back another day? He asked Paul directly, clearly, operating on the assumption that one dinner invitation naturally led to further visits. Maybe on a weekend when there's no school the next day so I can stay up later? The presumption of continued connection, so innocent, so unguarded, caught Paul off balance. In his world of calculated business relationships and strategic alliances, such straightforward expression of desire for ongoing interaction was rare. Before he could formulate a response, Lena interjected with gentle caution. Mick, remember, Mr. Blackwood has a very busy schedule with his important work. We can't expect— I'd like that very much, Paul interrupted, the words emerging with a certainty that seemed to surprise both Lena and himself. If that would be all right with your mother, of course. The exchange of glances between the adults was brief but laden with unspoken communication, her surprise giving way to cautious interest, his own expression conveying a sincerity he hoped was evident despite his relative inexperience with such personal overtures. "Well," Lena said finally, her composure returning though a slight blush colored her cheeks. "We could certainly arrange something. But for now, young man, it's bath and bed." She gestured firmly toward the bathroom, her tone brooking no further. Negotiation. Mick sighed dramatically but complied, pausing only to thrust Hoppy toward Paul for a farewell that was clearly non-negotiable. "Hoppy wants to say good night," he declared with absolute conviction. Paul, accepting the stuffed rabbit with a gravity that matched the boy's, solemnly wished Hoppy good dreams before returning him to his owner. The childish ritual should have felt ridiculous, and yet somehow it didn't. It felt like the acknowledgement of a connection that transcended conventional explanation, a bridge between past and present that was simultaneously painful and healing. While Mick was occupied with his bath, Paul and Lena returned to the living room, the subtle shift in dynamics palpable now that they were alone. "I apologize if Mick put you on the spot," Lena said, clearing the remaining dessert plates with efficient movements. "He doesn't quite grasp the concept of busy executives having limited social availability." Paul followed her into the small kitchen, instinctively taking the dishes she had collected and placing them in the sink despite her protests. "Please don't apologize," he replied, finding himself strangely eager to correct her assumption. "I meant what I said. I would very much like to visit again if you're comfortable with that." The direct expression of personal desire, not couched in business terms or strategic advantage, felt foreign on his tongue, a language long unused suddenly pressed into service. Lena studied him thoughtfully as she wiped down the counter, her expressive eyes assessing his sincerity. "This is all rather unusual, isn't it?" she observed finally. "The billionaire CEO and the single mom with the magical stuffed rabbit connecting them." The wry summary of their situation drew an unexpected chuckle from Paul, the sound surprising, both of them with its genuine amusement. "When you put it that way, it does sound like the premise for a particularly implausible novel," he acknowledged. "And yet, here we are." The shared moment of humor seemed to ease some invisible tension between them, allowing for a more direct conversation than might otherwise have been possible. "Why did you really come tonight, Paul?" Lena asked quietly, using his first name, for the first time since they'd met. "Is it just about Hoppy and the connection to your past, or—" She left the question open-ended, giving him space to define his own motivations without presumption. Paul considered her question with the same careful attention he might give to a complex business proposal, analyzing his own actions and motivations with uncharacteristic honesty. "It started with Hoppy," he admitted, after a thoughtful pause. "Seeing him that day on the street was like finding a piece of myself I'd forgotten was missing." He paused, searching for words to express concepts he rarely examined, much less articulated. But tonight wasn't just about the rabbit. It was about— He gestured vaguely toward the apartment that surrounded them, with its lived-in comfort and personal touches. This, a home that feels like a home, not a showpiece. Conversation that isn't primarily transactional. A meal shared without an agenda beyond the enjoyment of company. The words emerged with increasing certainty as he recognized their truth. "Do you know how long it's been since I've experienced any of that?" The rhetorical question hung between them, Paul's expression suggesting the answer was measured in decades rather than years. Lena's gaze softened with understanding that held compassion without pity. "Success can be isolating," she observed quietly, "especially the kind that puts you on magazine covers and creates a certain expectation of who you're supposed to be." The insight was delivered simply but cut to the heart of an experience Paul had never fully articulated even to himself. The gradual separation from ordinary human connection that had accompanied his rise to extraordinary wealth and power. Not just the sycophants and opportunists who inevitably surrounded the successful, but the self-imposed isolation that had come from his own relentless drive, his determination never to be vulnerable again after the devastating losses of his childhood. Yes, he agreed, the single syllable acknowledging a complex reality he rarely examined. Though I would be lying if I claimed it was entirely circumstantial. I built walls deliberately, Lena, kept people at a professional distance, focused on achievement rather than connection. The admission felt dangerous, a vulnerability he typically avoided at all costs, and yet there was strange relief in simply stating this truth aloud after decades of maintaining the fortress of his carefully constructed persona. Tonight reminded me of what exists on the other side of those walls, what I've been missing without fully realizing it. Lena absorbed this confession without judgment, her expression thoughtful as she considered its implications. "And what happens now?" she asked finally. "Is this a moment of clarity that fades when you return to your normal routine, or—" Again, she left the question open-ended, neither demanding nor assuming a particular answer. Paul found himself at an unfamiliar crossroads, one where the path forward wasn't clearly marked by profit projections or strategic advantages. "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty both uncomfortable and oddly freeing. "I haven't allowed myself much space for personal evolution in recent decades." The formal phrasing made Lena smile slightly, though her eyes remained serious. "That sounds like the kind of corporate terminology you might use in a board meeting about organizational change," she observed, gentle humor softening what might otherwise have been a pointed criticism. "Perhaps this is a situation that requires less analysis and more." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Exploration, without predetermined outcomes or fixed expectations." The suggestion was offered tentatively, as if she too was navigating unfamiliar territory, which, Paul realized, she likely was. A single mother with a demanding job and limited resources, she had as many reasons to be cautious about new connections as he did, though perhaps for different reasons. "Exploration," he repeated, considering the concept with genuine attention. "Without predetermined outcomes. That's not typically how I approach, well, anything." The self-assessment was delivered with a hint of wry self-awareness that surprised them both. "But I find myself willing to try, if you are." The simple statement carried more weight than its few words might suggest. An overture from a man who had spent decades avoiding precisely this kind of open-ended personal engagement. Lena studied him for a long moment, her expression revealing the careful assessment of a woman who had learned caution through experience. Then, with a directness that seemed characteristic of her approach to life, she nodded. "All right," she agreed. "Exploration it is, starting with that weekend visit Mick extracted from you with his unassailable 7-year-old logic." The terms thus settled, Paul found himself relaxing into a conversation that meandered pleasantly through topics both personal and philosophical as they waited for Mick to complete his bedtime routine. Lena shared stories of her work at the My Bookshop, her passion for literature evident in the way she described connecting readers with books that might speak to their particular needs or interests. Paul, in turn, found himself describing aspects of his business that went beyond profit margins and market dominance. The medical technologies his company had developed that were changing lives, the educational initiatives funded by his foundation, the environmental sustainability projects he had championed, despite initial resistance from more traditionally minded board members. As they talked, he realized with some surprise that he was sharing the parts of his work that brought him genuine satisfaction rather than merely impressive metrics, the human impact rather than the financial success that typically dominated his public narrative. The evening concluded with a formality that somehow didn't feel formal, a plan for Paul to join them the following Saturday for a visit to the Museum of Science, where a new space exhibition had captured Mick's enthusiastic interest. "Fair." "Warning," Lena said as she walked him to the door after Mick had finally succumbed to sleep. "He'll expect you to know every detail about the aerospace division of your company and probably the life history of every astronaut who ever lived." The teasing prediction was delivered with the fond exasperation of a mother who knew her child's passionate interests all too well. Paul found himself smiling in response, his fourth genuine smile of the evening, a personal record that would have stunned his executive team had they witnessed it. "I'll have my team prepare a briefing," he promised with matching humor. "Can't disappoint the expert, after all." As he drove back to his penthouse through the quiet streets of nighttime Boston, Paul found himself in a state of reflective contemplation, unusual for a man typically focused on forward momentum and strategic planning. The evening at Lena and Mick's modest apartment had affected him in ways he had not anticipated, stirring thoughts and feelings long dormant beneath his carefully constructed professional persona. The stuffed rabbit that had initially drawn him into their orbit had become more than just a nostalgic relic of his lost childhood. It had become a bridge to something he had denied himself for decades, the genuine human connection that existed beyond the transactional relationships of his business world. Whether this unexpected detour would develop into something lasting or simply serve as a poignant reminder of roads not taken remained to be seen. But as Paul navigated the final turns toward his luxury building with its state-of-the-art security and impeccable amenities, he found himself anticipating Saturday's museum visit with an eagerness that had nothing to do with business advantages or strategic positioning, and everything to do with a blue rabbit, a thoughtful woman, and a boy who saw the world with his heart wide open. The following weeks unfolded with a rhythm that gradually incorporated these new connections into Paul's rigorously structured life. Saturday at the Museum of Science led to Sunday afternoon at the park, which led to a midweek dinner when Paul unexpectedly found himself with a canceled business meeting and an impulse to call Lena rather than redirect the time to other work as he typically would have done. Each encounter deepened the bonds forming between them, Paul and Mick developing a relationship built on shared curiosity and the boys' unfiltered enthusiasm for everything from space exploration to the proper care and feeding of imaginary dragons, while Paul and Lena navigated a more complex connection that balanced growing personal attraction with the practical considerations of their vastly different lives and responsibilities. 3 weeks after their first dinner, Paul invited them to his penthouse, an unprecedented opening of his private space to others outside of occasional business gatherings that were more strategic than social. Mick's reaction to the spectacular views and cutting-edge technology that filled the apartment was everything he might have expected from an inquisitive 7-year-old, the boy racing from window to window with exclamations of wonder before settling into a detailed examination of the automated systems that controlled everything from lighting to temperature with vocal commands. "It's like living in a spaceship," he declared with approval, though his next observation carried more insight than Paul had anticipated from one so young. "But where are all your things? Like pictures and stuff that shows it's yours?" The innocent question highlighted what Paul had never fully acknowledged about his living space, that for all its luxury and technological innovation, it contained almost nothing of personal significance, nothing that reflected the man rather than his wealth. Lena noticed his momentary discomfort with her characteristic perceptiveness, smoothly redirecting Mick's attention to the spectacular view of Boston Harbor visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But later, when the boy was absorbed in a virtual reality game that Paul's tech team had developed, she returned to the observation with gentle directness. "Mick has a point, you know," she said quietly, glancing around the impeccably designed living area with its museum-quality art and clearly professional decorating scheme. "This place is impressive, but it could be a very high-end hotel suite. There's nothing here that feels like you." The observation wasn't delivered as criticism, merely as thoughtful noticing, but Paul found himself unexpectedly defensive nonetheless. "I'm rarely here except to sleep," he explained with a slight shrug. "It serves its purpose efficiently." The response emerged automatically, the same explanation he had given on the few occasions when others had made similar observations about the impersonal nature of his living space. Lena's expression suggested she recognized both the validity of his statement and the evasion beneath it. "Efficiency isn't the same as belonging," she observed softly. A house can function perfectly without being a home. The simple distinction struck Paul with surprising force, highlighting something he had sensed but never fully articulated about: the contrast between his penthouse and Lena's modest apartment. His space was objectively superior in every measurable way: larger, more luxurious, equipped with every convenience money could buy, and yet it lacked the essential quality that made her smaller, simpler apartment feel like a sanctuary rather than merely a residence. Before he could respond to this insight, Mick's excited voice interrupted their conversation, calling them to witness some virtual achievement that demanded immediate appreciation. The moment passed, but Lena's observation lingered in Paul's thoughts. A pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples of realization outward in expanding circles. The following week brought an unexpected development that tested the evolving bonds between them. Paul arrived at Lena's apartment for their now regular Friday dinner to find her uncharacteristically tense, her usual warm welcome subdued by evident worry. Mick, sensing his mother's mood despite her attempts to mask it, was quieter than usual. Hoppy clutched tightly to his chest as if the stuffed rabbit might provide protection against whatever was troubling their household. "What's wrong?" Paul asked directly once Mick had been settled with a book in his room. The boys' compliance with this request unusual enough to confirm the disruption in their normal patterns. Lena hesitated, her natural inclination toward self-sufficiency visibly warring with the trust that had developed between them over the past month. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she began, the automatic response of someone accustomed to handling her own problems without outside assistance. Then, meeting his concerned gaze, her resolve softened. "The bookstore is closing," she admitted finally. "The owners have been struggling for years, and with the new lease terms for the building." She shrugged, the gesture attempting casual acceptance but failing to disguise her genuine distress. "They've given us 2 weeks' notice. After that, I'm unemployed." The news hit Paul with unexpected force, his instinctive reaction a complex mixture of concern for Lena's practical situation and an immediate impulse to fix the problem with the resources at his disposal. It would be trivially easy for him to purchase the struggling bookstore, to ensure Lena's continued employment with a single phone call and transfer of funds that would register as a rounding error in his vast fortune. And yet, even as this solution presented itself with crystalline clarity, he hesitated, aware, from their previous interactions, of Lena's fierce independence and the delicate balance they were still establishing between his world of seemingly unlimited resources and her more constrained but deliberately chosen life. "I'm sorry," he said instead, genuinely meaning it. "I know how much you love that place, and how good you are at what you do there." The acknowledgement of her professional passion rather than immediate focus on the financial implications seemed to surprise and touch her, her expression softening from guarded worry to sad acceptance. "It's been more than just a job," she confirmed, moving to the kitchen to continue preparation for dinner with the practiced motions of someone finding comfort in routine tasks. For all its financial struggles, the cornerstone has been a community hub, a place where ideas and stories matter more than profit margins. She glanced at him, a wry smile briefly lighting her features. "I realize that sounds hopelessly idealistic to someone who runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation, but..." Paul shook his head, interrupting this self-deprecation. "Not idealistic," he corrected gently. "Valuable, in ways that don't appear on balance sheets but matter profoundly nonetheless." The sentiment was genuine, emerging from a perspective shift that had been gradually occurring since Hoppy had re-entered his life, bringing with him connections that operated outside the calculations of profit and loss that had governed Paul's existence for so long. Lena studied him thoughtfully, apparently recognizing the sincerity behind his words. "Thank you for that," she said softly. Most people would immediately jump to, "How will you pay your rent?" rather than understanding what's really being lost. The observation wasn't pointed, not an implicit criticism of materialistic values, but rather an appreciation of his ability to see beyond the immediate financial concerns to the deeper impact of the bookstore's closing. Paul nodded, moving to help her with the dinner preparations, in what had become a comfortable shared ritual over their weeks of acquaintance. The practical considerations are real too, of course, he acknowledged, aware that despite her philosophical approach to the situation, Lena would still be facing the very concrete challenge of finding new employment to support herself and Mick. "Do you have options?" The question was carefully phrased to avoid suggesting either helplessness on her part or presumptive assistance on his, a delicate navigation of their evolving relationship. Lena's hands continued their steady work. On the vegetables she was chopping for the meal, but her expression revealed the concern beneath her composed exterior. "Some," she replied honestly. "There are other bookstores in the area, though most are struggling with the same economic pressures that are closing the cornerstone. I could return to teaching. That was my original career before Mick was born, but it would mean recertification, which takes time and money." She paused, then added with characteristic directness, "I have savings that will cover a few months of expenses while I figure things out. We'll be okay." The assertion was confident, but not entirely convincing, and Paul recognized both the practical reality she was facing and the pride that prevented her from expressing the full extent of her worry. Before he could respond, a small voice interrupted from the kitchen doorway. "Are we going to have to move again?" Mick asked, his expression far too serious for a 7-year-old. Hoppy clutched protectively to his chest as if preparing for unwelcome change. The question revealed what Lena had been attempting to shield both Mick and Paul from: the possibility that this disruption might extend beyond employment to affect their housing situation as well. "No, buddy," she assured her son quickly, setting down her knife to give him her full attention. "We're going to be just fine right here, I promise." The conviction in her voice was absolute, though Paul suspected it came more from maternal determination than financial certainty. Mick studied his mother with the discerning gaze of a child who has learned to read adult concerns beneath reassuring words. "But if the bookstore closes, where will you work?" he pressed, not so easily diverted from the central issue. "And if you don't work, how do we pay for our apartment? That's how money works, right?" The practical analysis, delivered with a child's straightforward logic, hung in the air between them, Lena momentarily at a loss for how to respond without either false reassurance or burdening her son with adult worries beyond his years. "Your mom is very good at what she does," Paul interjected gently, drawing Mick's attention, "and smart people with skills are always needed. She'll find a new position, maybe even a better one than the bookstore." He met Lena's gaze over the boy's head, careful to avoid overstepping boundaries while still offering the genuine reassurance he felt. "And in the meantime, you don't need to worry about the apartment or anything else. That's grown-up business, and your mom has it under control." This affirmation of Lena's capability, rather than offering direct assistance, seemed to strike the right balance, as she gave him a small nod of appreciation, while Mick considered this perspective with characteristic thoughtfulness. "But what if it takes a long time?" the boy asked finally, his concern not entirely dispelled. "What if?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Lena interrupted firmly, kneeling to her son's level. "That's what we do, right? Face challenges as a team." The exchange was both heartwarming in its affirmation of their family bond and, concerningly, revealing of the practical realities they were facing. As dinner progressed, Paul found himself weighing various approaches to offering assistance without undermining Lena's independence or disrupting the careful balance they had established in their evolving relationship. Direct financial support would likely be rejected, he realized, both from pride and from legitimate concern about creating unhealthy power dynamics between them. Simply purchasing the bookstore to keep it open, while tempting in its straightforward solution, would be equally problematic, a grand gesture that might create more complications than it solved. By the time they had finished their meal and moved to the living room for the board game that had become part of their Friday ritual, Paul had formulated an approach that he hoped might thread the needle between respecting Lena's autonomy and addressing the genuine need at hand. "I have a proposition," he said carefully once Mick had been tucked into bed with Hoppy standing guard against nighttime monsters. A business proposition, he clarified, sensing Lena's immediate wariness at the phrasing. The Blackwood Foundation, the philanthropic arm of my company, has been considering a literacy initiative focused on underserved communities. What it lacks is someone with expertise in connecting readers with the right books, in creating programs that foster genuine engagement rather than just checking boxes for grant requirements. He paused, meeting Lena's increasingly skeptical gaze with calm sincerity. We need someone like you. And while I won't pretend the timing isn't convenient given your situation, this isn't charity. It's strategic recruitment of exactly the skill set the foundation requires. The explanation was delivered with the same straightforward logic he would use in any business context, though Paul was acutely aware of the personal undercurrents beneath this professional veneer. The question revealed what Lena had been attempting to shield both Mick and Paul from, the possibility that this disruption might extend beyond employment to affect their housing situation as well. No, buddy, she assured her son quickly, setting down her knife to give him her full attention. We're going to be just fine right here, I promise. The conviction in her voice was absolute, though Paul suspected it came more from maternal determination than financial certainty. Mick studied his mother with the discerning gaze of a child who has learned to read adult concerns beneath reassuring words. But if the bookstore closes, where will you work? He pressed, not so easily diverted from the central issue. And if you don't work, how do we pay for our apartment? That's how money works, right? The practical analysis, delivered with a child's straightforward logic, hung in the air between them, Lena momentarily at a loss for how to respond without either false reassurance or burdening her son with adult worries beyond his years. Your mom is very good at what she does, Paul interjected gently, drawing Mick's attention. And smart people with skills are always needed. She'll find a new position, maybe even a better one than the bookstore. He met Lena's gaze over the boy's head, careful to avoid overstepping boundaries while still offering the genuine reassurance he felt. And in the meantime, you don't need to worry about the apartment or anything else. That's grown-up business, and your mom has it under control. This affirmation of Lena's capability, rather than offering direct assistance, seemed to strike the right balance, as she gave him a small nod of appreciation, while Mick considered this perspective with characteristic thoughtfulness. But what if it takes a long time? The boy asked finally, his concern not entirely dispelled. What if? Then we'll figure it out together, Lena interrupted firmly, kneeling to her son's level. That's what we do, right? Face challenges as a team. The exchange was both heartwarming in its affirmation of their family bond and, concerningly, revealing of the practical realities they were facing. As dinner progressed, Paul found himself weighing various approaches to offering assistance without undermining Lena's independence or disrupting the careful balance they had established in their evolving relationship. Direct financial support would likely be rejected, he realized, both from pride and from legitimate concern about creating unhealthy power dynamics between them. Simply purchasing the bookstore to keep it open, while tempting in its straightforward solution, would be equally problematic, a grand gesture that might create more complications than it solved. By the time they had finished their meal and moved to the living room for the board game that had become part of their Friday ritual, Paul had formulated an approach that he hoped might thread the needle between respecting Lena's autonomy and addressing the genuine need at hand. I have a proposition, he said carefully once Mick had been tucked into bed with Hoppy standing guard against nighttime monsters. A business proposition, he clarified, sensing Lena's immediate wariness at the phrasing. The Blackwood Foundation, the philanthropic arm of my company, has been considering a literacy initiative focused on underserved communities. What it lacks is someone with expertise in connecting readers with the right books, in creating programs that foster genuine engagement rather than just checking boxes for grant requirements. He paused, meeting Lena's increasingly skeptical gaze with calm sincerity. We need someone like you. And while I won't pretend the timing isn't convenient given your situation, This isn't charity. It's strategic recruitment of exactly the skill set the foundation requires. The explanation was delivered with the same straightforward logic he would use in any business context, though Paul was acutely aware of the personal undercurrents beneath this professional veneer. Lena was silent for a long moment, her thoughtful gaze suggesting internal deliberation that weighed both practical necessities and deeper principles. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Not because I don't appreciate the offer, I do genuinely, but because I want to be sure any decision I make is for the right reasons." She met his gaze directly, her expression both serious and warm. "This thing between us, whatever it's becoming, it's important to me. Too important to complicate with financial dependence or professional obligation if that can be avoided." The simple acknowledgement of the growing significance of their relationship, articulated more directly than either of them had previously ventured, shifted the conversation from purely practical considerations to the emotional undercurrents that had been developing between them over the weeks since Hoppy had brought them together. Paul found himself nodding, a mixture of understanding and something warmer, more personal evident in his expression. "Take all the time you need," he assured her, meaning it despite his instinctive impulse toward immediate resolution. "The offer stands regardless of your decision, with no impact on us." The slight hesitation before the final word revealed the novelty of thinking in terms of a shared identity, however tentative, after decades of maintaining careful separation between himself and others. Lena's smile, warm, genuine, appreciative, suggested she recognized both the restraint it took for him to accept her need for deliberation and the significance of his acknowledgement of their evolving connection. "Thank you," she said simply, "for understanding and for caring enough to offer a solution while still respecting my need to make my own decisions." The gratitude was expressed without effusiveness, but with a sincerity that conveyed more than the words themselves. As Paul drove home that evening, contemplating the unexpected complexities of attempting to help someone whose independence was as fundamental to their character as Lena's clearly was to hers, he found himself reflecting on how profoundly his perspective had shifted in the weeks since a blue rabbit had reappeared in his life. Before Hoppy's unexpected return, he would have approached Lena's situation with the straightforward application of resources that had solved every problem he'd encountered for decades: buying the bookstore, paying off her apartment, establishing a trust fund for Mick's education, all with the efficient deployment of wealth that required minimal personal involvement beyond signing the necessary documents. That such generosity might be experienced as intrusive or undermining rather than helpful would not have occurred to him. The power to solve problems with money had been so thoroughly integrated into his identity that questioning its appropriateness in any context would have seemed absurd. Now, however, he found himself navigating a far more nuanced terrain, one where the simple application of financial resources might solve immediate practical problems while simultaneously damaging something more valuable: the genuine connection developing between them, built on mutual respect and recognition of each other's wholeness as individuals rather than defining their relationship primarily through giving and receiving. The realization was simultaneously uncomfortable and enlightening, challenging long-held assumptions about the nature of generosity and the true meaning of helping others. As he pulled into the private garage beneath his luxury building, Paul found himself wondering what his parents would have made of this situation. His father, with his modest teacher's salary but boundless intellectual curiosity. His mother, with her librarian's appreciation for the value of stories that transcended material worth. The thought brought a wistful smile to his face as he rode the private elevator to his penthouse apartment, increasingly aware of the contrast between its impeccable luxury and the lived-in warmth of Lena's modest home. The weeks that followed brought a gradual but unmistakable transformation to Paul's carefully ordered life. The penthouse that had functioned primarily as an elegant hotel suite began to acquire personal touches. Framed photographs of Mick and Lena appeared on previously bare surfaces. Children's artwork found pride of place on the refrigerator that had never held anything more personal than restaurant menus. And most significantly, A small cushioned chair appeared in Paul's bedroom, sized perfectly for a one-eared blue rabbit who occasionally spent weekends as his guest when Mick decided his old friend might enjoy a vacation at Mr. Paul's spaceship house. His executive team noticed the changes in their typically laser-focused CEO as well, meetings occasionally rescheduled around a second-grade science fair, phone calls interrupted to answer text messages featuring 7-year-old logic and enthusiastic overuse of exclamation points. Decisions informed by considerations beyond profit margins and market share. Robert Jenkins, observing these shifts with quiet attention, found himself both surprised and oddly encouraged by the gradual humanizing of the man he had served so loyally for decades. The Cornerstone investment is performing better than anticipated, he noted during one of their regular financial reviews, his tone carefully neutral, despite the knowing glint in his eyes. The educational program component in particular has shown promising results. The director appears quite competent. Paul met his CFO's gaze with equal professional composure, though a slight quirk at the corner of his mouth betrayed his awareness of the conversation beneath the conversation. "Yes, she is," he agreed simply. "In many areas." Robert nodded, allowing himself the briefest smile before returning to the financial reports spread between them. Nothing more needed to be said. The acknowledgement of their mutual understanding was sufficient. 6 months after their chance encounter at the bus stop, Paul found himself standing in Lena's small kitchen on a Sunday morning, attempting to master the art of pancake making under Mick's exacting supervision. "No, you have to wait until the bubbles are all over before you flip it," the boy instructed with the authority of a seasoned chef, Hoppy positioned safely away from potential batter splatter, but still within supervisory distance. "Mom always says patience is the secret ingredient in perfect pancakes." From the living room where she was setting the table for their now traditional Sunday breakfast, Lena called with amused exasperation, "Maybe don't repeat everything I say, buddy." Paul, focusing intently on the bubbling batter, as if it were a complex financial projection requiring his full analytical abilities, glanced up with a smile that transformed his typically serious features. "On the contrary, I find your son's comprehensive reporting of your wisdom extremely valuable," he replied, his tone managing to be simultaneously teasing and sincere. "His pancake consultancy services alone have been worth every penny of my recent investments." The playful reference to their initial meeting and the financial disparities that had once seemed so insurmountable drew a laugh from Lena, the sound as warm and nourishing as the morning sunlight streaming through her kitchen windows. As Paul successfully flipped a perfectly golden pancake to Mick's enthusiastic approval, he marveled at how thoroughly his priorities had shifted in the month since a stuffed blue rabbit had re-entered his life. The acquisition that had consumed his attention that fateful morning had been completed weeks ago, adding billions to Blackwood Enterprises' market capitalization, and yet he had barely spared it a thought beyond the necessary oversight. Instead, his mind had been occupied with matters his younger self would have dismissed as inconsequential, helping Lena navigate the logistics of expanding the Cornerstone's educational programs to additional locations, learning to be present in moments of ordinary joy rather than constantly driving toward the next achievement, and perhaps most significantly, considering whether the time might be right to suggest that these separate lives they had been gradually interweaving might work better as a single shared existence. As he watched Mick carefully arrange Hoppy on his special chair at the breakfast table, ensuring the rabbit had an optimal view of the pancake distribution process, Paul felt a profound sense of gratitude for the improbable sequence of events that had reconnected him with his childhood companion. And through that connection, with parts of himself long forgotten beneath the weight of ambition and achievement. The boy who had once whispered his fears and dreams to a one-eared blue rabbit had not been entirely lost in the man determined never to be vulnerable again. He had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, to re-emerge and reclaim his capacity for connection. And if that reconnection had come through a series of coincidences so unlikely they bordered on miraculous, a stuffed rabbit surviving a devastating fire, being rescued by a compassionate volunteer, cherished by her grandson, and then crossing, paths with its original owner 4 decades later, well, perhaps even a billionaire CEO built on ruthless rationality could allow himself to wonder if some things in life operated outside the careful calculations of probability and strategic planning. "Pancakes are ready," Mick announced triumphantly, the proud supervisor of a successful culinary operation. As they gathered around the table, Paul, Lena, Mick, and Hoppy in his place of honor, Paul reflected that perhaps this was what his mother had meant when she told him so many years ago, that sometimes the bravest heroes were the ones who had survived a few battles and had the scars to prove it, like the one-eared rabbit, who had journeyed through fire and time to find his way back to where he was needed most. Thank you for joining us for this heartwarming tale of unexpected connections and second chances. We'd love to know what your favorite part of the story was. Perhaps the moment Paul first recognized Hoppy at the bus stop, or Mick's generosity in sharing his beloved rabbit, or maybe the gradual transformation of a lonely billionaire into a man capable of true emotional connection. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Until next time, remember that sometimes our most treasured possessions are valuable not for what they cost, but for the connections they represent and the memories they hold.